The rifle shot echoed across the dusty main street of Aurora, Nevada, and Elena Winters didn't even flinch as she continued walking toward the schoolhouse with her books pressed against her chest, her dark blue dress swirling around her ankles despite the morning heat of September 1876. The men lounging outside the saloon watched her pass with a mixture of admiration and fear, their conversations dying as quickly as tumbleweeds caught in a windstorm. Elena had that effect on people. At 23 years old, she carried herself with a confidence that most women in the frontier town could only dream of possessing. Her copper-red hair was always pulled back in a severe bun, her green eyes sharp enough to cut through steel, and her tongue sharper still. She had arrived in Aurora 2 years ago from Boston, bringing with her an education from one of the finest academies back east and a reputation that preceded her like thunder before lightning. The previous schoolteacher, a mousy woman named Mrs. Henderson, had married a merchant and moved to San Francisco, leaving Aurora's children without proper education for nearly 6 months. The town council had advertised far and wide, desperate for someone qualified, and Elena had answered. Nobody quite knew why a woman of her obvious breeding and education would choose to come to a dying mining town in the middle of Nevada's harsh landscape. But she had arrived with 3 trunks, a letter of recommendation from the Massachusetts Board of Education, and an attitude that suggested she would tolerate neither foolishness nor questions about her past. Within her first week, Elena had established rules that shocked the community. She would teach boys and girls together, something that raised eyebrows among the more traditional families. She would include literature and science alongside the standard reading and arithmetic. And most controversially, she announced that any parent who wished to question her methods could find their children another teacher, knowing full well there was no alternative for miles in any direction. The men of Aurora had noticed her immediately, of course. How could they not? She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost out of place among the weathered faces and sun-damaged skin of the frontier. Her complexion remained pale despite the harsh Nevada sun, suggesting she took great care to protect it. Her figure, though modestly dressed, was undeniably attractive. And there was something about the way she moved, spoke, and conducted herself that suggested refinement and grace. But Elena Winters had made it abundantly clear from the start that she had no interest in courtship, marriage, or the attentions of any man in Aurora. When Tom Brennan, the owner of the general store, had approached her with flowers and an invitation to Sunday dinner, she had thanked him politely and declined so firmly that he never asked again. When William Foster, one of the more successful miners, had offered to escort her to the town's Independence Day celebration, she had informed him that she was perfectly capable of walking 3 blocks unaccompanied. When even the handsome young doctor, fresh from medical school in Philadelphia, had suggested they might have much in common given their Eastern backgrounds, she had simply said that she doubted it very much and excused herself from the conversation. After 6 months of such rejections, the men of Aurora had collectively decided that Elena Winters was untouchable. Whispers circulated about why such a woman would remain so stubbornly single. Some suggested she had been jilted by a lover back east and was nursing a broken heart. Others claimed she was secretly married and hiding from a violent husband. The more imaginative gossips proposed that she had committed some scandal that forced her westward, or that she had taken religious vows of chastity, or even that she preferred the company of women to men. The truth was that nobody knew, and Elena offered no explanations. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a simple wooden structure with a pitched roof and 6 windows that let in the morning light. Elena had insisted on the windows being properly fitted with glass, rather than just shutters. Another expense that had made the town council grumble. But she had won that battle as she won most, through sheer force of will and the implicit threat that she would leave them without a teacher again if they refused reasonable requests. She was arranging books on her desk when she heard boots on the wooden steps outside. It was too early for students who would not arrive for another hour. Elena looked up as a tall figure filled the doorway, silhouetted against the bright morning sun. "Miss Winters," a deep voice said, and the man removed his hat as he stepped inside. Elena felt her breath catch slightly, though she would never admit it. She had seen him around town before, of course. Everyone had. Quentin Rourke was not a man who went unnoticed. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of hard labor. His hair was dark brown, almost black, and worn slightly longer than was fashionable, curling at his collar. His face was tanned and weathered from days spent under the sun, with a strong jaw, high cheekbones, and eyes of such a striking blue that they seemed almost unnatural. He was dressed as most cowboys dressed, in worn denim pants, a cotton shirt rolled up at the sleeves to reveal muscular forearms, a leather vest, and boots that had seen better days. Quentin Rourke was 28 years old and worked at the Double R Ranch about 5 miles outside of Aurora. He was known as an excellent horseman, a fair hand with cattle, and someone who kept to himself mostly. Unlike many of the ranch hands who spent their wages on whiskey and card games, Quentin seemed to have more serious pursuits. He was often seen reading books borrowed from the few private collections in town, and more than once Elena had spotted him sketching landscapes in a battered notebook while sitting outside the boarding house where he rented a room. "Mr. Rourke," Elena said, her voice carefully neutral. "School does not begin for another hour. If you have business with me, I ask that you make it quick. I have preparations to complete." Quentin stepped fully into the room, his hat held respectfully in both hands. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, which Elena found oddly endearing before she firmly pushed that thought away. "I apologize for the intrusion, Miss Winters," he said. His voice was deep and pleasant, with only the slightest hint of a southern accent that suggested he had come from somewhere farther east and south, though he had clearly spent years in the West. "I wanted to speak with you before the children arrived." "About what, precisely?" Elena asked, turning back to her desk and continuing to arrange her materials. She found it easier to maintain her composure when she was not looking directly at him. "About your teaching," Quentin said, and she heard him take a few steps closer. "I have a proposal for you." Elena's spine stiffened. She had heard proposals before, and they always led to the same uncomfortable conversations. "Mr. Rourke, if this is some attempt at courtship disguised as academic interest, I will ask you to leave immediately. I have made my position on such matters quite clear to every man in this town." "It is not," Quentin said quickly, and there was something sincere in his voice that made Elena pause. "I want to learn to read better, and to write properly. And maybe some of that mathematics you teach the older children." Elena turned to face him fully, surprise evident on her features before she could school them into her usual cool expression. "You wish to attend school?" "Not with the children, of course," Quentin said, and a slight smile touched his lips. "That would be ridiculous, and I am sure the parents would object, but I thought perhaps you might be willing to offer private lessons. In the evenings after your regular teaching day is done. I can pay you for your time." Elena studied him carefully. This was unexpected. She had grown accustomed to men approaching her with romantic intentions thinly veiled as something else. But Quentin Rourke stood before her with his hat in his hands, his posture respectful, his blue eyes meeting hers directly, and she saw no deception there. Only earnest desire for education. You can read already, I assume? Elena asked. Some, Quentin admitted. My mother taught me the basics before she died when I was 12. I can manage signs and simple books, but I know I sound ignorant when I speak, and my writing is barely legible. I want to improve myself, Miss Winters. I have been saving money, and I have plans beyond ranch work. But I know I need education to achieve them. There was something in his openness that touched Elena despite her best efforts to remain detached. She had dedicated her life to education, after all. How could she refuse someone genuinely seeking to better himself? What plans? She asked, partly from curiosity and partly to gauge whether he was truly serious. Quentin seemed to consider whether to share this information, then apparently decided that honesty was his best approach. I want to own land, not just work on someone else's ranch, but have property of my own. Maybe raise horses rather than cattle. Horses are my real passion, but I know that successful ranchers need to be able to read contracts, keep books, correspond with buyers. I cannot do those things properly now. Elena felt herself soften slightly. It was a practical goal, sensibly explained. And the desire for self-improvement was something she could respect. I charge 50 cents per lesson, she said, naming a figure that was more than fair but not so low as to seem like charity. Lessons would be 2 hours, 3 times per week. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings, from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock. You would need to purchase your own materials, books, and paper, which I can recommend. And you would need to complete assignments between lessons. I will not waste my time on a student who does not do the work. That is more than reasonable, Quentin said, and his face lit up with a smile that transformed his features from merely handsome to genuinely striking. When can we start? This Friday, Elena said. That gives you time to acquire the necessary materials. Come to the schoolhouse at 6 o'clock sharp. If you are late, I will assume you are not serious and the arrangement will be terminated. I will be here, Quentin promised. He placed his hat back on his head and nodded respectfully. Thank you, Miss Winters. You would not know it, but you are giving me a real gift. After he left, Elena stood in the empty schoolhouse for a long moment, wondering if she had just made a mistake. She had built such careful walls around herself, had so successfully discouraged any personal connections in Aurora beyond those strictly necessary for her work. But there had been something in Quentin Rourke's eyes, something honest and hungry for knowledge that had bypassed all her usual defenses. It was just teaching, she told herself firmly. She was a teacher. This was what she did. There was nothing more to it than that. The week passed in its usual rhythm. Elena taught her classes, corrected papers, prepared lessons, and maintained her routine of walking from her small rented room at the boarding house to the schoolhouse and back again each day. She took her meals alone in her room, having long ago discouraged the other boarders from trying to engage her in conversation. She attended church on Sunday because it was expected, but she sat in the back pew and left immediately after the service ended. By Friday evening, Elena had almost convinced herself that Quentin Rourke would not appear. Men often expressed grand intentions that dissolved like morning mist when faced with actual effort. She had prepared a lesson plan anyway, out of professional habit, but she expected to spend the evening alone as she did most evenings, reading one of the books she had brought from Boston. At precisely 6 o'clock, she heard boots on the steps. Quentin appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, carrying a satchel over one shoulder. His hair was damp, suggesting he had washed before coming, and he wore a clean shirt. These small efforts at respectability touched something in Elena that she firmly pushed away. "Good evening, Miss Winters," he said. "I am here and on time as promised." "So I see," Elena replied. She gestured to one of the student desks in the front row. "Sit there, please. Let me see what materials you have acquired." Quentin set his satchel on the desk and removed several items. He had purchased a slate and chalk, a writing tablet, 2 pencils, and a primer that Elena herself had recommended to the general store for parents who wished to work with their children at home. "Excellent," Elena said approvingly. "You followed my instructions precisely. Now, before we begin, I need to assess your current abilities. Please take a pencil and paper and write the following sentence. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog." Quentin did as instructed, his large hand gripping the pencil awkwardly, his letters uneven and poorly formed. But he completed the sentence with all words spelled correctly, which was more than many of her younger students could do. "Now read aloud from this," Elena said, handing him one of her own books, a collection of American poetry. She opened it to a page at random, a Longfellow poem. Quentin read slowly and haltingly, stumbling over longer words, but he got through the first stanza with determination. His pronunciation was rough, but the meaning was there. "Good," Elena said, taking the book back. "You were honest about your abilities, which I appreciate. You have a foundation to build upon. We will work on handwriting first, as that is most immediately practical. Better penmanship will help you form letters correctly, which will aid your spelling. We will also work on vocabulary and reading comprehension. I will assign you readings to complete between our lessons." "Whatever you think is best, Miss Winters," Quentin said. "You are the expert." They worked for 2 hours straight, with Elena demonstrating proper letter formation and Quentin practicing diligently. He was a focused student, she discovered, not easily distracted and willing to repeat exercises until he got them right. He asked intelligent questions about why certain letters were formed in specific ways, and he seemed genuinely interested in the explanations she provided about the history of written language. When the clock on her desk chimed 8, Elena was surprised at how quickly the time had passed. "That is enough for this evening," she said. "For Monday, I want you to practice writing the alphabet, both uppercase and lowercase letters, at least 10 times each. Focus on consistency in letter size and spacing. Also, read the first 3 chapters of this primer and be prepared to discuss them." "Yes, madam," Quentin said, gathering his materials carefully. He pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket and counted out 50 cents in coins, placing them precisely on Elena's desk. "Will the same time work for Monday, 6 o'clock?" Elena confirmed. "Do not be late." After Quentin left, Elena sat alone in the schoolhouse, the coins still sitting on her desk where he had placed them. She felt an odd mix of emotions that she could not quite identify. Teaching Quentin had been different from teaching children. He brought an adult perspective, an understanding of why education mattered in practical terms. Their conversation had been more collegial than she had expected, more like a discussion between equals, despite the teacher-student dynamic. She picked up the coins and placed them in her reticule, then gathered her own things and locked the schoolhouse door. The evening air was cooling rapidly, as it always did in Nevada once the sun set. Stars were beginning to appear in the vast sky overhead, more stars than she had ever seen in Boston, where city lights obscured all but the brightest. Elena had just started walking back toward the boarding house when she heard raised voices from the direction of the saloon. This was not unusual. Men drinking often led to arguments. She quickened her pace, having no desire to be on the street if violence erupted. But then she heard her own name shouted, and she stopped. "That schoolteacher thinks she is too good for any of us," a slurred voice said. It sounded like William Foster, the miner who had once asked to escort her. "Walking around like she is some kind of queen, Someone should teach her a lesson about proper respect. "Leave it alone, Foster," another voice said, one Elena did not recognize. "She is just a woman with particular ways." "No harm in that. No harm," Foster laughed bitterly. "She makes fools of decent men, needs to be taken down a peg or two, needs to be reminded that she is not in Boston anymore." Elena felt her heart begin to pound. She was still 100 yards from the boarding house, alone on the darkening street. The saloon doors swung open and 3 figures stumbled out, Foster and 2 other men she recognized as fellow miners. She considered her options quickly. She could run, but that would show fear, and she suspected that might make things worse. She could continue walking at her normal pace and hope they would lose interest. Or she could turn around and go back to the schoolhouse, but that would mean being even more isolated. Before she could decide, another figure emerged from the shadows between 2 buildings. Quentin Rourke moved to stand between Elena and the 3 miners, his posture relaxed, but somehow conveying readiness. "Evening, gentlemen," Quentin said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet street. "Nice night for a walk." "This is not your concern, Rourke," Foster said, squinting at him. "Go back to your ranch." "I think I will stick around," Quentin said easily. "Miss Winters and I were just discussing educational matters. I am walking her back to the boarding house." "Were you now?" Foster said, his tone mocking. "The schoolteacher taking on charity cases, teaching cowboys to read. That is rich." "Miss Winters is an excellent teacher," Quentin said, ignoring the insult. "Now, if you gentlemen will excuse us, it is getting late." He turned and offered his arm to Elena without actually looking at her. She hesitated for only a moment before taking it, recognizing that this was not about romance but about safety and social convention. A man escorting a woman was within acceptable boundaries in a way that a woman walking alone at night increasingly was not. "Thank you," she said quietly as they walked past the miners, who grumbled but did not follow. "No thanks necessary," Quentin replied, equally quiet. "Those men are drunk and stupid, but they are not truly dangerous. Still, no point in taking chances." They walked in silence for a moment, Elena acutely aware of the solid strength of his arm beneath her hand, the steady rhythm of his gait matching hers. When they reached the boarding house, she released his arm and stepped back, restoring proper distance between them. "That was timely," she said, meeting his eyes. "You have my gratitude, Mr. Rourke." "Quentin," he said. "If we are to be working together regularly, perhaps we could dispense with excessive formality. Though I will continue to call you Miss Winters unless you instruct otherwise. I know propriety matters to you." Elena considered this. It was true that excessive formality could become cumbersome. And there was something about Quentin that made her want to relax her usual rigid rules just slightly. "You may call me Elena," she said, "but only during our lessons. In public, formality should be maintained." "Agreed," Quentin said, a smile touching his lips. "Good night, Elena. I will see you Monday evening." After he left, Elena climbed the stairs to her room, her thoughts in unusual turmoil. She had maintained her distance from everyone in Aurora for 2 years, had built walls of ice and formality that kept the world at bay. But somehow, in the space of 1 week, Quentin Rourke had found a crack in those walls simply by being genuinely himself, honest, respectful, and kind. She undressed for bed and lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the town settling for the night. The distant piano music from the saloon, the occasional shout or laugh, the bark of a dog somewhere. Boston had been loud in different ways, with carriage wheels on cobblestones and factory whistles and the constant press of humanity. Aurora was quieter but no less alive. Elena had fled Boston 2 years ago after a scandal that had destroyed her engagement and her reputation in certain circles. Her fiancé, a respected lawyer, had been discovered in an affair with a married woman, and rather than take responsibility for his actions, he had somehow managed to shift the blame onto Elena. He had suggested that her cold nature had driven him to seek warmth elsewhere, that her insistence on maintaining her teaching position after their engagement was announced showed she did not truly wish to be a wife. Society had eaten up these lies eagerly, as it always seemed to when men lied about women. The engagement had been broken, but the damage was done. Elena's reputation was tarnished through no fault of her own. She had chosen to leave rather than endure years of whispers and speculation. Her father, a professor of literature, had been disappointed in her for not fighting to clear her name. Her mother had been simply relieved that the scandal had not been worse. Her younger sister had married shortly after Elena's departure and had written precisely once since then, a brief note announcing the birth of a daughter. Elena had reinvented herself in Aurora as a woman who needed no one, who wanted no attachments. It had been easier than she expected. The West offered opportunities for reinvention that the rigid East never would. But in creating this new self, this untouchable schoolteacher, she had also created a lonely existence. Now here was Quentin Rourke, offering nothing but a desire to learn, and somehow his simple presence had reminded her of what she had given up by closing herself off so completely. The human connection of teaching an eager student, the pleasure of intellectual exchange, the comfort of knowing someone cared enough to walk you home when danger threatened. She told herself it was just education, just teaching, nothing more. But as she drifted off to sleep, she remembered the warmth of his arm beneath her hand and the kindness in his blue eyes, and she wondered if she had been lying to herself. The weekend passed slowly. Elena spent Saturday cleaning her room, washing her clothes, and preparing lesson plans for the following week. Sunday brought church and the usual cold civility from the other congregants, who had long ago stopped trying to engage her in conversation. She saw Quentin across the small church, dressed in his Sunday best, sitting with other ranch hands from the Double R. He nodded politely when their eyes met, but made no move to approach her. She appreciated his discretion. Monday evening arrived, and with it, Quentin returned to the schoolhouse at precisely 6 o'clock. He had completed all the assignments Elena had given him, his alphabet practice showing marked improvement even in just 3 days. They worked on reading comprehension, with Elena asking him questions about the material to ensure he truly understood what he had read, not just decoded the words. Why do you think the author chose to describe the landscape in such detail? Elena asked after Quentin had finished reading a passage from the primer. Quentin thought for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. I think maybe to help the reader feel like they are there, he said slowly. Like when I am working with horses, I notice things about how they move, what their eyes look like, whether they are nervous or calm. Someone who has never worked with horses might not notice those things. So the author is trying to help people notice the landscape the way someone who lives there would notice it. Elena felt a small thrill of pleasure at his answer. Exactly, she said. That is excellent analysis, Quentin. You have a natural aptitude for reading comprehension. His smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. Thank you. I never thought of myself as good at this sort of thing. I always figured I was just not smart enough for books. Intelligence comes in many forms, Elena said. You are clearly intelligent about horses and ranch work. Reading and writing are simply skills that must be learned like any other. With practice, you are proving to be quite adept. They continued working through the lesson, and again the 2 hours passed quickly. When they finished, Quentin carefully counted out his payment and gathered his materials. Same time Wednesday, he asked. Yes, Elena confirmed. Then, hesitating slightly, she added, Quentin, about Friday night, I wanted to properly thank you for intervening with those miners. That situation could have become unpleasant. You do not need to thank me, Quentin said. But I have been thinking about it, and I wonder if perhaps I should walk you home after our evening lessons. Not because I doubt your capability, but because it seems like the practical thing to do. Those men know you are at the schoolhouse late now, and drunk men are unpredictable. Elena's first instinct was to refuse, to insist on her independence, but she forced herself to consider the suggestion objectively. Quentin was right that drunk men were unpredictable, and Foster had already shown himself to be bitter about her rejections. And having Quentin walk her home was not some grand romantic gesture, it was simply practical safety precaution. That would be acceptable, she said finally. Thank you. And so a pattern developed over the following weeks. 3 times a week, Quentin would arrive at 6 o'clock sharp for his lessons. They would work for 2 hours on reading, writing, and eventually mathematics, which Quentin absorbed with surprising quickness once he understood the practical applications. Then he would walk Elena back to the boarding house, their conversations ranging from literature to horses to life in general. Elena found herself looking forward to these walks almost as much as the lessons themselves. Quentin was an engaging conversationalist once he relaxed, with thoughts and observations that frequently surprised her. He had traveled more than she had realized, working on ranches from Texas to Montana before settling in Nevada. He had stories about cattle drives and wild horses, about storms that seemed to split the sky open, and nights so cold that water froze solid in seconds. Why did you settle in Aurora? Elena asked one evening as they walked under a sky brilliant with stars. It was late October now, and the air had a sharp bite that promised winter. I was tired of moving, Quentin said simply. I have been working ranches since I was 14, and for a long time it felt like I was always chasing something just over the horizon. But I am 28 now, and I started thinking about what I want my life to look like when I am 40 or 50. I do not want to be an old cowboy still working for someone else's wages. I want something of my own, and Aurora is in good horse country. The Double R has a decent operation, and the owner, Mr. Richardson, is a fair man. I can learn here, save money, and maybe in a few years buy land nearby. That is a solid plan, Elena said, and your reading and writing have improved remarkably. You could easily handle the business side of ranching now. Thanks to you, Quentin said, glancing at her. I know I said it before, but you have given me a real gift, Elena. I do not think you fully understand what this means to me. There was such sincerity in his voice that Elena felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Teaching someone who genuinely wants to learn is its own reward, she said quietly. You have been an excellent student. They reached the boarding house, and Quentin tipped his hat as he always did. But this time, Elena found herself not wanting him to leave quite yet. Quentin, she said, surprising herself, would you like to come to the harvest social next week? The town is having one at the church hall. I generally do not attend these sorts of things, but I thought perhaps this year I might make an exception. Quentin's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, pleasure, and then something more complicated. Are you certain? He asked carefully. People will talk if we arrive together. You have worked hard to keep your distance from that sort of speculation. Let them talk, Elena said, and she was surprised by how much she meant it. I am tired of living my life according to other people's judgments. If I wish to attend a social with a friend, that is my business. A friend, Quentin repeated, and his smile was soft and warm. I would be honored to accompany you, Elena, truly honored. The harvest social was held on a Saturday evening in early November. Elena spent an unusual amount of time preparing, choosing her best dress, a deep green silk that she had not worn since leaving Boston. She pinned her hair in a softer style than her usual severe bun, allowing a few tendrils to frame her face. When she looked at herself in the small mirror above her wash basin, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked younger, softer, almost approachable. Quentin arrived to collect her at 6 o'clock, dressed in dark trousers, a white shirt, and a black vest that made his blue eyes seem even brighter. His hair was neatly combed, and he had clearly taken care with his appearance. When he saw Elena, his eyes widened and his smile was instantaneous. "You look beautiful," he said, and there was nothing practiced or calculated in the compliment. It was simply the truth as he saw it. "Thank you," Elena said, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "You look quite presentable yourself." They walked to the church hall together, and Elena was acutely conscious of the attention they drew. Heads turned, conversations paused, and she knew that by tomorrow morning everyone in Aurora would know that the untouchable schoolteacher had attended the harvest social with Quentin Rourke. But for once, she found that she truly did not care. The church hall was decorated with autumn leaves and dried corn stalks, bundles of wheat and arrangements of pumpkins and gourds. Tables lined the walls, laden with food that the women of the town had prepared: roasted chickens and beef, fresh bread, pies and cakes, preserves and pickles. A small group of musicians was setting up in one corner, preparing to provide dancing music later in the evening. Quentin guided Elena to one of the tables and brought her a cup of apple cider, then stood beside her as various townspeople approached to greet them. Elena noticed that people seemed friendlier than usual, perhaps because she was finally behaving in a more socially acceptable manner by attending a community event. Or perhaps because Quentin's presence somehow made her less intimidating. "Miss Winters, Mr. Rourke," a woman's voice said, and Elena turned to see Martha Simmons, the doctor's wife. Mrs. Simmons was one of the few women in town who had always been kind to Elena, despite receiving no particular warmth in return. "How wonderful to see you both here." "Are you enjoying the evening?" "Very much," Elena said, and found that she meant it. "You have all done a lovely job with the decorations." "We do try," Mrs. Simmons said with a warm smile. Then, lowering her voice slightly, she added, "I am glad to see you letting yourself enjoy life a bit, Miss Winters. You work so hard with the children, but everyone needs some pleasure in their lives too." The music started, a lively fiddle tune, and couples began moving to the center of the hall to dance. Quentin looked at Elena with a question in his eyes. "I should warn you that I am not an expert dancer," he said. "Most of my experience is at rough cowboy dances where nobody cares much about proper steps." "I am quite familiar with proper steps," Elena said, surprising herself again. "If you are willing to try, I can guide you." They moved onto the dance floor, and Quentin placed his hand at her waist with careful respect, while Elena rested her hand on his shoulder. He held her other hand in his, and they began to move to the music. He was right that his dancing was not polished, but he had a natural sense of rhythm, and he followed her lead willingly. Elena found herself laughing when he stumbled slightly, and the sound of her own laughter surprised her. How long had it been since she had laughed like that, freely and genuinely? "I told you I was not expert," Quentin said, grinning at her, "but I am trying my best." "You are doing wonderfully," Elena assured him. "Just relax and feel the music. Dancing is not about perfect steps, it is about moving together." They danced several more dances, and Elena was conscious of Quentin's hand warm at her waist, his blue eyes watching her face, the slight smile that never quite left his lips. She was also conscious of being happier than she had been in years. The realization should have frightened her, but somehow it did not. It felt instead like coming home after a long journey, like finally putting down a heavy burden she had been carrying for too long. When the musicians took a break, Quentin and Elena stepped outside into the cool November air to escape the warmth of the crowded hall. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. "Thank you for inviting me tonight," Quentin said quietly. "I know it was not easy for you to make that step." "Thank you for accepting," Elena replied. "I have spent 2 years keeping everyone at a distance. I convinced myself it was necessary, that I was protecting myself. But recently I have begun to wonder if I was just hiding." "Hiding from what?" Quentin asked gently. Elena was quiet for a long moment, debating how much to share. But something about the darkness, the privacy of the moment, and the genuine care she heard in Quentin's voice made her want to tell the truth. "I was engaged before I came to Aurora," she said finally. "To a lawyer in Boston. He seemed perfect on the surface, educated, successful, from a good family. But it turned out he was having an affair with a married woman. When the affair was discovered, he managed to blame me somehow. He told people that my cold nature had driven him away, that I cared more about teaching than about being a proper wife. And society believed him because it was easier to blame a woman than to hold a man accountable for his choices." "That is despicable," Quentin said, anger clear in his voice. "To betray you and then lie about it." "Yes," Elena agreed. But what hurt almost as much as his betrayal was how quickly everyone believed his version of events. People I had known for years, people I thought were friends, simply accepted that I must have done something wrong, so I left. I came west to start over, to be someone who did not need anyone else, who could not be hurt again. But being alone is its own kind of hurt," Quentin said softly. "Yes," Elena whispered. "Yes, it is." Quentin reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle and careful. "I am sorry that happened to you, Elena. You deserved better. You deserve better now." Elena looked up at him, at his face half in shadow and half in the light spilling from the church hall windows. She saw nothing but sincerity and kindness, and something else she was almost afraid to name. He was looking at her as if she was precious, as if she mattered, and it had been so long since anyone had looked at her that way. "Quentin," she said, her voice barely audible, "I think I am frightened." "Of what?" he asked, though his tone suggested he knew the answer. "Of this," she admitted. "Of whatever this is between us. Of caring again and being hurt again. Of trusting someone and having that trust destroyed." "I cannot promise you will never be hurt," Quentin said honestly. "Life does not work that way. But I can promise that I would never deliberately hurt you, that I would never lie to you or betray your trust. And I can promise that whatever this is between us, it is real for me. You are not just some woman I am courting because you are pretty or convenient. You are Elena Winters, intelligent, strong, dedicated, and yes, beautiful. You are someone worth knowing, worth spending time with, worth caring about." Tears pricked at Elena's eyes, surprising her. She had cried perhaps twice since leaving Boston, having decided that tears were a weakness she could not afford. But these were different tears, born not of pain but of relief and hope. "I care about you too," she said quietly. "I have been trying not to, but I do. You have somehow gotten past all my defenses just by being yourself." Quentin smiled and gently squeezed her hand. "Then perhaps we can simply see where this leads. No pressure, no expectations. Just 2 people spending time together and seeing what develops." "I would like that," Elena said. They stood in the cool darkness for a few moments longer, hands clasped, before returning to the warmth and noise of the social. But something had shifted between them. Some barrier had been crossed. When they danced again later that evening, Elena allowed herself to move closer, to rest her head briefly against Quentin's shoulder, to enjoy the simple pleasure of being held. When Quentin walked her home that night, they paused at the door of the boarding house for a long moment. He did not try to kiss her, which Elena appreciated. Instead, he simply brushed his thumb gently across her knuckles and told her he would see her Monday evening for their next lesson. After he left, Elena climbed to her room and stood at the window, watching his figure disappear into the darkness. She felt different somehow, lighter and freer than she had in years. She had spent so long building walls, and now those walls were beginning to come down. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The following months brought changes to Aurora and to Elena's life. Winter arrived in earnest, bringing snow that transformed the dusty mining town into something almost magical. Elena continued teaching her regular classes, and Quentin continued his evening lessons, though they both knew his skills had advanced far beyond what she could offer. The lessons had become an excuse, a socially acceptable reason for them to spend time together. They were courting, though neither had formally acknowledged it as such. Quentin walked her home after every lesson. He began attending church every Sunday and sitting in the pew beside her. When supplies came in for the school, he appeared to help unload them. When Elena caught a bad cold in January, he brought her soup and sat outside her door reading aloud to her through the wood, making her laugh despite her congestion. The town noticed, of course. People who had once regarded Elena with mixture of respect and fear now smiled at her warmly and greeted her as if she were truly one of them. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. By allowing Quentin into her life, by showing vulnerability and genuine affection, Elena had somehow become human in the eyes of Aurora's residents. In February, Quentin took Elena to see the Double R Ranch for the first time. He borrowed a wagon for the 5-mile journey, bundling her in blankets against the cold. The ranch was larger than Elena had expected, with a sprawling main house, several outbuildings, extensive corrals, and what seemed like miles of fencing. Mr. Richardson runs about 200 head of cattle and maybe 30 horses, Quentin explained as he drove the wagon past the main house toward the corrals. The horses are his real interest, though. He breeds working stock mostly, good solid animals for ranching. But I have been talking to him about possibly expanding into more refined breeds, horses for riding rather than just working. He pulled the wagon to a stop near one of the corrals where several horses stood watching their approach with interest. Quentin helped Elena down, then led her to the fence. "That one there, the bay mare," he said, pointing to a beautiful horse with a reddish-brown coat and black mane. "That is Rosie. She was half wild when Mr. Richardson bought her 3 years ago. She had been mistreated by her previous owner and would not let anyone near her. But I worked with her, spent months just sitting in her corral, letting her get used to me. Eventually she started approaching me, and then one day she let me touch her. Now she is one of the gentlest horses on the ranch. She would be perfect for a lady to ride." As if understanding she was being discussed, the mare walked over to the fence. Quentin produced an apple from his pocket and offered it to her on his flat palm. She took it delicately, her soft nose brushing his hand. "Would you like to touch her?" Quentin asked Elena. Elena had limited experience with horses, having always traveled by carriage or train in Boston. But she found herself reaching out slowly, placing her hand on the mare's warm neck. The horse's coat was softer than she expected, and she could feel the powerful muscles beneath. Rosie stood patiently, seeming to sense Elena's nervousness. "She likes you," Quentin said with a smile. "Animals have good instincts about people." They spent the afternoon touring the ranch, with Quentin pointing out various aspects of the operation and explaining his ideas for improvements. Elena could hear the passion in his voice when he talked about horses, the same passion she felt when discussing education. It occurred to her that they were similar in that way, both dedicated to their work, both striving to make something better. "There is land available about 2 miles from here," Quentin said as they drove back toward Aurora in the late afternoon. 50 acres with a small cabin and a stream running through it. The previous owner moved to California. "I have been saving money, and I think by next spring I could afford to buy it. It would not be much at first, just me and a few horses, but it would be a start." "That sounds wonderful," Elena said sincerely. "You should do it, Quentin. You clearly have the knowledge and the dedication." Quentin was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the reins. Then he said, "It would be lonely, though, building a life alone." Elena understood what he was really saying, what he was really asking without asking directly. Her heart began to beat faster. "Yes," she said softly. "I imagine it would be." They drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence, but Elena's mind was racing. She knew where this was heading, had known for weeks if she was honest with herself. Quentin was going to ask her to marry him, perhaps not today but soon. And she was going to have to decide if she was brave enough to say yes, to take that leap of faith and trust another person with her heart. When spring came to Aurora, it came suddenly and gloriously. The snow melted almost overnight, streams swelled with runoff, and the desert bloomed with unexpected colors. Elena's students were restless with the season, eager to be outside in the warmth after months of cold. She found herself equally restless, conscious that change was coming. Quentin had completed the purchase of his land in March and was spending every free moment preparing to move his operation there. He had given notice at the Double R, though Mr. Richardson had been understanding and had even sold Quentin several horses at a fair price to help him get started. Among them was Rosie, the bay mare who had taken to Elena. On a warm Saturday in April, Quentin took Elena to see his new property for the first time. The cabin was small but solidly built, with 2 rooms and a good stone fireplace. The stream Quentin had mentioned ran clear and cold through the eastern edge of the property, lined with cottonwood trees that provided shade. The land itself was partially flat and partially rolling hills, perfect for horses. "It needs work," Quentin said as they stood in front of the cabin. "The roof needs repairs, the corrals need to be rebuilt, and the cabin itself needs everything from new windows to a proper kitchen. But the bones are good. I can make something of this." "It is perfect," Elena said, and she meant it. She could see what the place could become with effort and care. She could imagine horses grazing in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney, maybe a garden planted near the house. "Elena," Quentin said, taking her hand, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." She turned to face him, her heart pounding. His blue eyes were serious, holding hers. "Can you see yourself being happy here?" he asked quietly. "Not just visiting, but living here, making a life here with me." Elena looked around at the land, the cabin, the endless sky. Then she looked back at Quentin, at this good man who had somehow slipped past all her defenses with patience and kindness and genuine respect. "Yes," she said simply, "I can." Quentin smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, worn velvet faded from age. "This was my mother's ring," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small ruby. "It is not fancy, but it is real. Like what I feel for you is real. Elena Winters, will you marry me? Will you help me build a life here, raise horses, maybe raise children someday? Will you take a chance on a cowboy who loves you more than he knew it was possible to love anyone? Tears were streaming down Elena's face now, but they were good tears, happy tears. "Yes," she said through her tears. "Yes, Quentin Rourke, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as if it had been meant for her all along. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her for the first time, gentle and sweet and full of promise. Elena kissed him back, allowing herself to feel everything she had denied for so long: love, hope, joy, trust, desire. All the emotions she had locked away came flooding back, overwhelming and wonderful. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this choice," he promised. "I will be worthy of your trust." "You already are," Elena said softly. "You have been from the beginning." They were married in June in the small church in Aurora, with most of the town in attendance. Elena wore a simple white dress that Martha Simmons had helped her sew, with wildflowers in her hair. Quentin wore a new suit that probably cost more than he should have spent, but he wanted to look his best for her. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, with promises exchanged and rings blessed. The celebration afterward was held at Quentin's ranch, which was already beginning to look more established. He had repaired the cabin, built new corrals, and started breaking horses to sell. Several families from town had brought food, and tables were set up outside under the cottonwood trees. There was music and dancing, and for the first time in her life, Elena felt completely surrounded by genuine community. As the sun set and the party continued, Quentin pulled Elena away from the crowds, leading her to the stream where they could have a moment of privacy. "Happy?" he asked, pulling her close. "Incredibly," Elena said, leaning into his embrace. "I never thought I could feel this way again. You have given me so much, Quentin." "We have given each other something," he corrected. "You taught me that I could be more than just a cowboy. You believed in me when I barely believed in myself. You gave me education and confidence and hope. And somehow you also gave me your heart, which is the greatest gift I could ever receive." "You earned it," Elena said, "by being patient and kind and genuine. By seeing me as I really am and wanting me anyway." They stood by the stream as darkness fell and stars emerged overhead, holding each other and listening to the distant sounds of celebration. This was their beginning, Elena thought. Everything before had been preparation for this moment, this choice, this leap into a shared future. Life on the ranch was different from anything Elena had experienced. She continued teaching during the school year, riding Rosie the 3 miles to Aurora each morning and back each evening. Quentin had taught her to ride, patient and encouraging as she learned. On days when weather was bad, she stayed at the boarding house during the week and came home on weekends. But she found she missed the ranch terribly on those nights, missed waking up next to Quentin, missed the sound of horses in the corrals, missed the vast openness of the land. In the evenings and on weekends, Elena helped Quentin with the ranch work. She learned to care for horses, to mend fences, to keep the books that tracked expenses and sales. She discovered she had a talent for the business side of ranching, organizing their accounts in ways that made it easy to see where they were profitable and where they needed to improve. Quentin relied on her judgment increasingly, asking her opinion on major decisions. By their first anniversary, the ranch was thriving. They had 20 horses, several of which Quentin had bred and trained himself. He had developed a reputation for producing excellent working stock, and ranchers from across Nevada were coming to buy from him. The cabin had been expanded with 2 additional rooms, and Elena had planted a substantial garden that provided vegetables throughout the summer. In the fall of their 2nd year of marriage, Elena realized she was pregnant. She told Quentin one evening after dinner, watching his face carefully to gauge his reaction. They had discussed children in abstract terms, but had not planned anything specific. Quentin's expression transformed through several emotions: shock, joy, fear, and then something like awe. He pulled Elena into his arms, holding her carefully as if she might break. "A baby," he whispered. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Elena asked, though she could feel his answer in the way he held her. "Happy does not begin to describe it," Quentin said. "Terrified, yes, but happy beyond words. You are going to be a mother, Elena, and I am going to be a father. We are going to be a family." Elena continued teaching through the winter, though she informed the school board that she would need to take time off once the baby was born. To her surprise, they were accommodating, promising to find a temporary replacement and welcoming her return whenever she was ready. The town that had once seemed cold and distant had become truly home, full of people who cared about her and Quentin. In April, as spring returned to Nevada, Elena went into labor. Martha Simmons attended her, along with the doctor's wife who had nursing experience. Quentin paced outside the cabin, too nervous to stay inside but too worried to go far. The labor was long but ultimately uncomplicated, and as dawn broke over the ranch, Elena gave birth to a healthy baby boy. When Quentin was finally allowed inside, he approached the bed where Elena lay exhausted but radiant, holding their son wrapped in a soft blanket. Quentin sat carefully on the edge of the bed, his large calloused hand gently touching the baby's tiny perfect face. "He is beautiful," Quentin said, his voice rough with emotion, "just like his mother." "He has your eyes," Elena said softly. The baby's eyes were the same striking blue as his father's. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names but never quite decided. Now, looking at their son, Quentin said, "Samuel, after your father. You have told me he was a good man, even if you disagreed about how you handled leaving Boston. Maybe this is a way to build a bridge back to your family." Elena felt tears slip down her cheeks. Her relationship with her parents had been distant since she left Boston, limited to occasional letters that said much about facts and little about feelings. But perhaps Quentin was right. Perhaps a grandchild might soften old hurts. "Samuel Rourke," she said, testing the name. "Yes. I like that very much." The weeks after Samuel's birth were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Elena was surprised by how much she loved being a mother, by how fiercely protective she felt of this tiny person. Quentin was equally devoted, getting up for nighttime feedings even though he had to work the next day, changing diapers without complaint, spending hours just sitting with his son and talking to him about horses and ranching and life. Elena wrote to her parents announcing Samuel's birth and including a small photograph that a traveling photographer had taken. To her surprise, her mother wrote back immediately with congratulations and an unexpected apology. Her letter acknowledged that perhaps they had been too quick to believe the worst of Elena, too influenced by social pressures and convention. She expressed hope that they might rebuild their relationship and perhaps even visit Nevada to meet their grandson. "See," Quentin said when Elena read him the letter, tears streaming down her face. "Good things come from honest steps forward. You took a chance on me, on this life, on opening yourself up again, and look at everything you have gained." By the time Samuel was 6 months old, Elena had returned to teaching part-time, bringing the baby with her to the schoolhouse. The students were enchanted by having a baby in class, and the older girls helped care for him during lessons. It was unconventional, but so much about Elena's life had been unconventional. She had learned to embrace it. The years passed in the way years do when life is full and happy. Samuel grew from baby to toddler to young boy, bright and curious and kind like his father. The ranch continued to thrive, growing to include 40 horses and several hired hands to help with the work. Quentin's reputation as a horseman spread beyond Nevada, and buyers came from California, Utah, and Colorado. When Samuel was 4, Elena became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to twin daughters with Elena's copper-red hair and Quentin's blue eyes. They named them Rose after the mare that had first connected Elena to ranch life, and Margaret after Quentin's mother. The cabin had to be expanded again to accommodate the growing family. Elena cut back her teaching to only 3 days a week, focusing more on her family and the ranch. She found that she did not miss the full-time work as much as she had expected. Teaching had been her identity for so long, but now she had other identities that fulfilled her just as much: wife, mother, rancher, partner in building a life. On their 10th anniversary, Quentin took Elena back to the spot by the stream where they had stood on their wedding night. The ranch had grown substantially around them, but this spot remained unchanged, peaceful and private. "You remember what you said to me here?" Quentin asked, holding her hand. "I said you had given me so much," Elena recalled. "And you said we had given each other something." "I was right," Quentin said with a smile. "Look at what we have built together, Elena. Look at our family, our home, our life. None of this would exist if you had not been brave enough to let me past your walls, if you had not taken a chance on a cowboy who wanted to learn to read. And none of it would exist if you had not been brave enough to approach the schoolteacher no man dared court," Elena replied. "Everyone else saw me as cold and untouchable, but you saw me as someone worth knowing, worth teaching, worth loving. You gave me back my life, Quentin." "We gave each other life," Quentin said. "Real life, full life, shared life, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat." He kissed her there by the stream as the sun set over their ranch, and Elena thought about the long journey that had brought her here. From Boston to Aurora, from heartbreak to healing, from isolation to love. She had thought she was running away when she came west, but really she had been running toward something. Toward this man, this place, this life. The sound of children's laughter drifted from the direction of the house, where Samuel was playing with his sisters under the supervision of their hired hand. In a few minutes, they would need to go back, to give baths and tell stories and tuck small bodies into bed. But for now, Elena leaned into her husband's embrace and allowed herself to feel grateful for every choice that had led her here. "I love you," she told Quentin, words she said often but never took for granted. "I love you too," he replied. "Today, tomorrow, always." As darkness fell over the ranch and stars emerged in the vast Nevada sky, Elena Winters stood with her husband and looked toward the house that held their children and thought about the future that stretched ahead of them. There would be challenges, certainly. Life always brought challenges. But they would face them together, as partners, as lovers, as friends. The cowboy had been brave enough to court the schoolteacher, and the schoolteacher had been brave enough to let herself be courted. And from that bravery had come everything else: love, family, home, belonging. It had been worth every risk, every fear, every moment of vulnerability. It had been worth it all. The children grew quickly, as children do. Samuel showed his father's way with horses, spending every free moment in the corrals. By the time he was 8, he could ride as well as most adults, and had a gentle patience with even the most skittish animals. The twins, Rose and Margaret, were different from each other despite being identical in appearance. Rose loved the ranch life, following her brother and father around and begging to be allowed to help with the work. Margaret, though, showed her mother's scholarly inclinations, always reading books and asking questions about everything from geography to science to history. Elena treasured these differences in her children, encouraging each of them to pursue their own interests. She had learned from her own life that forcing people into predetermined roles only led to unhappiness. So Samuel was taught to be gentle and thoughtful alongside being strong and capable. The girls were encouraged to ride and rope alongside learning to read and calculate. The Rourke children were growing up understanding that people could be complex and multifaceted, that there was no single right way to live a life. The ranch had become one of the most successful horse operations in Nevada by the time the children were in their early teens. Quentin had fulfilled his dream of breeding not just working stock, but also riding horses of quality and beauty. He had imported several mares from back east with excellent bloodlines, and the resulting foals commanded impressive prices. The small cabin had been replaced by a proper ranch house with 6 bedrooms, a large kitchen, a dining room, and even a parlor where Elena kept her growing library of books. But success had not changed the fundamental nature of who Quentin and Elena were. They still worked alongside their hired hands, still ate dinner together as a family every night when possible, still walked by the stream on summer evenings when the day's work was done. They had learned early in their marriage that the best parts of life were the simple parts: conversation and touch and shared laughter, children's voices and animal sounds and wind in the cottonwood trees. Elena's relationship with her family back east had gradually healed over the years. Her parents had visited twice, surprised and impressed by the life their daughter had built. Her sister had written more regularly after the birth of her own children, perhaps understanding better now what mattered. Elena would never return to Boston to live, but she had made peace with her past and the people in it. The town of Aurora itself had seen changes over the years. The silver mines that had built the town were playing out, and population was declining as miners moved on to other prospects. But the town still had a school, a church, a general store, and enough families to maintain a community. Elena had continued teaching, training several younger women to eventually take over when she decided to fully retire. She had shaped an entire generation of Aurora's children, giving them not just knowledge but confidence and possibility. On a warm evening in late summer, when Elena was 45 and Quentin was 50, they sat on the porch of their ranch house watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Samuel, now 22, was working with a young stallion in the main corral. The twins, 18 years old, were in town visiting friends. For a rare moment, Quentin and Elena were alone together. "You ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had stayed in Boston?" Quentin asked, his hand finding Elena's where it rested on the arm of her chair. "Sometimes," Elena admitted. "I probably would have eventually married someone suitable but uninspiring. I would have continued teaching until my husband insisted I stop. I would have had children and raised them to be proper Eastern Society members. I would have been safe and respectable and profoundly unhappy." "No regrets then?" Quentin asked with a slight smile, though his eyes were serious. "Not a single one," Elena said firmly. "You gave me a life worth living, Quentin. You, our children, this ranch, this community. I have been more myself here than I ever was in Boston. I have been free to be complicated and contradictory, to be both tough and tender, to be a teacher and a rancher and a mother and a wife. All of those things at once, without having to choose. You gave me that same freedom," Quentin said. "I was just a cowboy with dreams when we met. You helped me become educated, articulate, confident. You believed I could be more than what I was, and you partnered with me in building something real and lasting. I could not have done any of this without you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Samuel work with the horse. He had his father's patience and his mother's intelligence, a powerful combination. He would inherit the ranch someday, Elena knew, and he would run it well. The twins would forge their own paths, Rose perhaps staying in ranch life and Margaret perhaps pursuing education in the cities. All three children had been raised to understand that they had choices, that their lives were their own to shape. "I want you to know something," Elena said softly. "When I first came to Aurora, I was so angry. Angry at my former fiancé, angry at society, angry at myself for being naive enough to trust and hope. I had convinced myself that the answer was to never trust or hope again. I built those walls so high and so thick that I thought nothing could penetrate them. But I did," Quentin said with a small smile. "But you did," Elena confirmed. "Not by being aggressive or persistent in the way other men were. You did it by being genuine. By asking for something I could give without risk education. And then by being patient and respectful and kind, day after day, week after week. You wore down my defenses not through force but through consistent goodness. And by the time I realized I was falling in love with you, it was too late to stop it. Not that I wanted to stop it. I fell in love with you the first time I saw you walking down the street of Aurora with your books and your proud bearing," Quentin confessed. "You were so beautiful and so fierce, like nothing I had ever seen. But I knew immediately that approaching you the way other men did would not work. You would just build your walls higher, so I found another way. I asked for lessons because I genuinely needed them, but also because it gave me a legitimate reason to be near you, to talk to you, to gradually show you who I really was." "It was brilliantly subtle," Elena said with a laugh. "I never saw it coming." "Good," Quentin said, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "Because if you had seen through me, you might have ended the lessons before I had a chance to prove myself." As the sun finally slipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared, Samuel finished his work and headed toward the house. He waved to his parents on the porch, his smile visible even in the dimming light. He was happy, Elena thought. All her children were happy, and so was she. Against all odds, against all her fears and defenses, she had found happiness here in Nevada with a cowboy who had dared to court her. The years continued to pass in that peaceful rhythm of seasons and work and family. Elena eventually retired from teaching completely when Margaret announced her intention to pursue a teaching certificate herself. It seemed fitting somehow that the legacy would continue. Rose married a neighboring rancher and started her own horse operation with her husband, remaining close enough to visit frequently. Samuel took over more of the daily operations of the Rourke ranch as Quentin began to slow down slightly with age. When Elena was 53, her father died back in Boston. She made the long journey east for the funeral, bringing Quentin with her. It was her first time back in over 30 years, and the city seemed both familiar and utterly foreign. The buildings were taller, the streets more crowded, the pace more frantic than she remembered. She felt claustrophobic within hours of arriving. The funeral was attended by many people Elena had known in her youth, though few of them recognized her immediately. She had changed, she realized. Not just aged, but fundamentally transformed. The severe, defensive young woman who had fled Boston was gone, replaced by someone more settled and confident. She stood beside her mother and sister at the funeral and felt sympathy, but not the deep grief she might have expected. Her life was in Nevada now, with Quentin and their children. Boston was just a place she used to live, a chapter of her life that had closed long ago. On the train ride back west, Elena leaned against Quentin's shoulder and watched the landscape change outside the windows. From the green hills of the east to the vast plains of the middle country to the dramatic mountains and deserts of the west, each region beautiful in its own way, but only one feeling like home. "Thank you for coming with me," she said to Quentin. "I do not think I could have faced that alone." You would not have been alone even if I had not been there, Quentin said. You are stronger than you think, Elena. You always have been. Perhaps, Elena said, but I prefer being strong with you beside me. They arrived back at the ranch to find Samuel had managed everything perfectly in their absence, and the twins had come home to help. The whole family gathered for dinner that night, and Elena looked around the table at these people she loved: her husband, her children, the hired hands who had become like family. This was her life, she thought. This messy, beautiful, imperfect, perfect life. Elena and Quentin's 60th birthdays came within months of each other, and their children insisted on throwing them a celebration. Half the county seemed to attend, gathering at the ranch for a day of food and music and storytelling. People shared memories of Quentin teaching them about horses, or Elena teaching them to raid. Young couples credited Elena with helping them learn to write love letters to each other. Ranchers talked about horses they had bought from Quentin 20 years ago that were still working strong. As the party wound down and the last guests departed, the family sat together on the porch in the cooling evening air. Samuel was there with his wife and 2 young children. Rose had come with her husband and their son. Margaret had traveled from Carson City, where she was now teaching at a larger school. The grandchildren were chasing fireflies in the yard, their laughter carrying on the breeze. "You two have built something remarkable," Margaret said, looking at her parents. "Not just the ranch, but a legacy. Everyone at that party today has been touched by you in some way. You have shaped this entire community." "We just lived our lives as best we could," Elena said modestly. "We worked hard and tried to be good to people. Nothing remarkable about that." "But there is," Samuel argued. "You could have been bitter after what happened to you in Boston, Mother. You could have stayed closed off and angry. Instead, you let Father love you, and together you built all of this. That took courage." "Your father had the courage first," Elena said, smiling at Quentin. "He was brave enough to approach me when everyone else had given up. He saw something worth knowing when others saw only someone cold and untouchable." "I saw the real you," Quentin said simply. "And I knew immediately that getting to know that real person would be worth whatever effort it took." The conversation continued as darkness fell, and the children grew tired. Eventually, the grandchildren were carried inside to be put to bed in their parents' old rooms. Margaret retired to her room to grade papers she had brought with her. The younger generation drifted off to their own homes and rooms, leaving Elena and Quentin alone once more on the porch. 60 years old, Elena said wonderingly. "When did that happen?" "Gradually, then suddenly," Quentin replied with a chuckle. "Some days I still feel like that 28-year-old cowboy who nervously asked a beautiful schoolteacher for reading lessons. Other days, every year is evident in my aching joints." "You are still beautiful to me," Elena said, reaching over to take his hand. And it was true. Time had marked them both, had given them gray hair and lined faces and bodies that moved more slowly than they once did. But when Elena looked at Quentin, she still saw the man who had patiently taught her to ride, who had held her hand through childbirth, who had built this life alongside her one day at a time. "And you are still the most beautiful woman I have ever known," Quentin said. "Inside and out. Time has only made you more yourself, if that makes sense. More confident, more complete, more at peace with who you are." They sat together until the night grew cold and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Then they went inside to the home they had built together, climbed the stairs to the bedroom they had shared for decades, and lay down in the darkness with their hands clasped between them. This was love, Elena thought as she drifted toward sleep. Not the dramatic passion of youth, though they had known that too, but something deeper and more sustaining. Partnership and companionship and the comfort of being truly known by another person. The years slowed but did not stop. Elena and Quentin passed their 70th birthdays, then their 75th. The ranch continued under Samuel's capable management. More grandchildren arrived and then great-grandchildren, the ranch house often full of young voices and running feet. Elena's health remained good, though she moved more carefully now. Quentin had some trouble with his heart, but the doctor said it was managing well enough with care. On a spring morning when Elena was 78 years old, she woke to find Quentin sitting in the chair by the window of their bedroom, looking out at the ranch with an expression of deep contentment. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice still rough with sleep. "Everything," Quentin said simply. "All of it. This life we have lived together. I was thinking that if I could go back and tell that young cowboy what his life would become, he would not believe me. I had such modest dreams back then. I wanted to own a little land, raise some horses, maybe find a good woman to share it with. But what I got was so much more than that. I got you, Elena. I got a true partner who made everything possible. I got children who became good people. I got grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I got to live in this place I love doing work that matters to me. How did I get so lucky?" Elena rose carefully from the bed and went to sit on the arm of his chair, placing her hand on his shoulder. "It was not luck," she said. "It was bravery. You were brave enough to approach me when no one else was, and I was brave enough to let you in when every instinct told me to push you away. And then we were brave together, building this life day by day." Quentin covered her hand with his. "I want you to know that I have no regrets. None. Every choice I made that led me to you was the right choice. Every day with you has been a gift. Even the hard days," Elena asked with a slight smile. "The years when money was tight, the times we disagreed, the sleepless nights with sick children, even those," Quentin confirmed. "Especially those, maybe, because we faced them together. We were never alone in our struggles. That is what marriage is supposed to be, I think. Not avoiding hardship but facing it together." They sat together as the sun rose higher, flooding the room with golden light. Below them, the ranch was coming to life. Samuel was already in the corrals with the horses. One of the grandchildren was helping with morning feeding. Everything continued in its rhythms, the work that never truly stopped on a ranch. "I love you," Elena said, words she had spoken thousands of times but which never lost their meaning. "I thank God every day that you walked into my schoolhouse that morning and asked for lessons. You changed my entire life, Quentin Rourke." "And you changed mine," Quentin replied. "You made me believe I could be more than just a cowboy. You saw potential in me that I did not even see in myself. And you loved me, truly loved me, which is the greatest gift I have ever received." Quentin Rourke died peacefully in his sleep 3 weeks later, 1 month after his 80th birthday. He simply did not wake up one morning, his heart having finally given out after 8 decades of faithful service. Elena was devastated by the loss, though she had known it was coming eventually. They both had, but knowing did not make the reality easier to bear. The funeral was enormous, with people traveling from across Nevada and California and Utah to pay their respects. Quentin had touched many lives through his work with horses, his fair dealings, and his genuine kindness. The service was held at the ranch rather than in town, under the open sky that Quentin had loved. He was buried on a hill overlooking the stream, the spot where he had proposed to Elena so many decades ago. In the weeks after Quentin's death, Elena found herself struggling to adjust to life alone. She had been part of a pair for so long that being singular felt wrong, unnatural. But her children rallied around her, and the grandchildren visited constantly, and gradually, Elena found a new rhythm. She spent her days reading, working in her garden and watching the ranch continue under Samuel's guidance. She wrote letters to her sister and old friends. She organized family gatherings and told stories about Quentin to the younger generations who had not known him as well. One evening in late summer, nearly a year after Quentin's death, Elena walked to the stream where he was buried. She brought flowers from her garden and placed them on the grave, then sat on the grass beside it. "I miss you," she said aloud, not caring if anyone heard her talking to the dead. "Every single day I miss you, but I want you to know that I am all right. Our children are taking good care of me, and the ranch is thriving. Samuel is teaching his son the business, so it will continue for another generation at least. Rose's daughter is showing real talent with horses. Margaret's grandson is talking about becoming a teacher. Your legacy continues in all these ways, Quentin." She sat in silence for a while, listening to the water moving over stones, the wind in the cottonwood trees, the distant sounds of the ranch. Then she continued speaking, knowing he could not hear but needing to say the words anyway. "You were right that day we sat on the porch when you said we had given each other life. Real life, full life, shared life. I was only half alive when I came to Aurora, Quentin. I was so wounded and defensive and afraid, and you woke me up. You reminded me that it was possible to trust, to hope, to love. You showed me that not all men were like the one who betrayed me, that there were good men in the world. Men who kept their promises and meant what they said and loved truly and deeply." A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermal currents. Elena watched it for a moment, remembering how Quentin had loved watching the birds, how he could identify different species by their flight patterns alone. "Thank you," she said finally. "Thank you for being brave enough to court the schoolteacher no man dared court. Thank you for seeing me when others only saw my walls. Thank you for 54 years of partnership and love and laughter. Thank you for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Thank you for this ranch, this home, this life. Thank you for everything." Elena Winters Rourke lived another 5 years after her husband's death, years filled with family and memories and quiet contentment. She died in her sleep at age 83, peacefully and without suffering, surrounded by the love of the family she and Quentin had created. She was buried beside him on the hill overlooking the stream, reunited with her partner in death as they had been in life. The ranch continued for generations, passing from Samuel to his son and then to his grandson. The story of Elena and Quentin became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The tale of how a brave cowboy had courted an untouchable schoolteacher, how patience and genuine respect had won over fear and defensiveness, how two people had built something lasting through partnership and love. In the years that followed, when young people in the family faced struggles in love or life, they were reminded of Elena and Quentin's story. They were told that love required bravery, that walls could be overcome with patience, that the best relationships were built on friendship and respect as much as passion. They were encouraged to see potential in others, to give people chances, to believe that change and growth were possible. The ranch itself stood as testament to what could be built when two people committed to a shared vision. What had started as 50 rough acres and a run-down cabin had become a thriving operation spanning several hundred acres, known throughout the West for quality horses. But more than that, it had become a home, a gathering place for family, a center of community. The values that Elena and Quentin had lived by hard work, education, kindness, integrity permeated every aspect of the ranch's operations. The small ring with the ruby that Quentin had given Elena was passed down through generations of Rourke women, each one hearing the story of how it had once belonged to Quentin's mother, and how he had offered it to a woman who thought she would never love again. The ring became a symbol of hope and second chances, a reminder that it was never too late to open your heart. The schoolhouse in Aurora eventually closed when the town's population dwindled, but the impact of Elena's teaching lived on in the generations she had educated. Those students grew up to become ranchers and businessmen, teachers and doctors, spreading across the West and carrying with them the lessons she had taught. They remembered a strict but fair teacher who expected excellence and believed in their potential. They remembered a woman who had shown them that education was not just about books, but about becoming fully yourself. In the end, the story of Elena Winters and Quentin Rourke was not just their story, but the story of everyone who chooses bravery over fear, connection over isolation, love over self-protection. It was the story of how walls can come down when the right person approaches them with patience and genuine care. It was the story of how two people can build something greater together than either could have created alone. The cowboy had been brave enough to try when no other man dared, and the schoolteacher had been brave enough to let him succeed. And from that mutual courage had come everything else: a life, a family, a legacy. It was a love story in the truest sense, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Not because it was easy, but because they worked at it every single day. Not because they never faced hardship, but because they faced it together. Their love had transformed not just themselves, but everyone around them, rippling out across generations and geography in ways they could never have imagined. It proved that one genuine connection could change the world in small but meaningful ways. That bravery mattered. That second chances were possible. That love, when given and received with open hearts, could create miracles. And so the story lived on, passed from parent to child, from generation to generation. A reminder that it is never too late to open your heart, never too scary to take a chance on love, and never impossible to build something beautiful from broken pieces. Elena and Quentin had proven that, and their legacy would continue as long as their family remembered them and told their tale.